So on last week's video I went to a popular nearby photographic spot to get a picture of a moonrise, something which I've never done before, but I managed to get this image here, which I'm actually pretty happy with and dare I say I'm quite proud of. If you want to see a little bit more of that trip, you can find it at the top now. But getting this image wasn't without challenges. Post-processing it and specifically dealing with the focus stacking of 12 images that I took for this was incredibly challenging. So in this little bonus video, I'm going to show you a little bit of the behind the scenes post-processing that I used for this image and some of the challenges that I encountered. So let's jump in. So I've got my series of images now loaded into Lightroom. And I'm going to start with my infinity image as my baseline image, and this is the picture that I took at infinity focus. And then once I've edited this, I'm going to copy out all of the post-processing edits to all the other images in my sequence. So my first instinct looking at this is it's a bit underexposed. I probably could have done running it at a higher ISO, but I don't think that's going to matter in this circumstance. So I think we're going to need to cool it down a little bit, because moonlight shots I tend to think of as quite cool shots. There's a little bit too much warmth in that. I'm going to run down the highlights a little bit because they're just a bit overbearing in that sky. The shadows need to come up quite significantly. I'm not too worried about the foreground, it's more the rocks around the lighthouse which is my concern, because they are what's in focus here. So I'll run it to about there. In terms of whites, I'll probably lift those up a little bit as well, actually. Something like that. And I don't think I need to go anywhere near the blacks because, yeah, there's quite a lot of blacks as you'll see in the histogram already. But yeah, I'm not concerned about the foreground. Clarity, I'm going to bump that up a little bit. Maybe something about there. Vibrance, yeah, let's punch out those colours a little bit more. Not going anywhere near saturation, I don't think it needs it. Perhaps just a little bit more contrast. Something like that. Lens corrections, I need to pump those in. Yep, looking better. Get rid of the distortions from the lens. And then I think we could do with a little bit of noise reduction, because when you're looking closely here, there's a fair amount of grain in there. It's not too bad, because I shot this at ISO 2000, so it's quite forgiving on the D850, but still, let's run it at about there. So that is my baseline edit. Now I'm going to copy that over to all the other images in the sequence. One other thing, my horizon is clearly out, so I need to correct that before I copy the settings over to the other images in the sequence. There we go, that looks a lot better. So if I now just copy all of the settings, make sure all the boxes are ticked, copy, and then I'll paste them across to all the other images in my sequence. Once I've copied the settings across all the images in my sequence, I now need to just make specific tweaks to some of the images. So for example, some of these images which have got the foreground in focus, I need to lift that foreground a little bit. It's still too underexposed. So I just go to the exposure setting here and just lift it up, something there, and it just moves that histogram slightly to the right, and I think it looks a lot better for that. So if I go through and just change that on the different foreground shots, I think that will deliver a better final image. So now that I'm happy with the core edits that I've made to all my photos, I'm going to export them into Photoshop as layers, and this is going to allow me to focus stack them. Now, because I'm exporting so many layers, the process is quite slow, so this could take some time. Now you may notice that suddenly my layers are less in number, and the reason for this is showing you focus stacking on like 12 different images is going to be the most boring thing in the world. So to make this video a little bit more straightforward, I've pre-focus stacked batches of these images. This should make it a lot easier to explain, and it doesn't actually change the process whatsoever. Before you start any focus stacking, you need to make sure your images are perfectly aligned, otherwise it's going to look rubbish. So select all your layers and go up to edit and auto align layers. And that, with a little bit of magic, does it for you. You can see that my images were very slightly out. So once they're aligned, the easiest way to do your focus stacking is to go up to Edit and select Auto Blend Layers. Make sure these boxes are ticked and press OK. And what Photoshop is going to do is it's going to scan all your images and it's going to compile what it thinks are the sharpest bits of the images together and compile them into one image. But I don't particularly always like this method, and I'll show you exactly why. Once that process is done, you'll have your image and it looks a little bit of a mess. Just look at some of these areas, particularly up in the sky here. It looks like it's all over the place. And that's what I tend to find with this method. I don't personally rate it. I think it's good for quite simple focus stacking jobs. But if you're doing anything complex with quite a few images, I tend to find it lets you down. For example, if we look at the image which gives the focus in the near foreground and we turn that off, we can see that Photoshop is putting parts of that image right into the backdrop of the image, which is totally wrong. And if we look at the other end of the scale, the infinity shot, and turn that layer off, you can see that it's putting bits in the near foreground, which really doesn't make any sense. And what this sort of delivers is a very blotchy kind of result where you've got very fuzzy kind of sections of the image. For example, you can see a big one just sitting in the sea here, or in the actual rocks down around here you can see there's one, and it's just more hassle than it's worth. So I prefer to do my focus stacking in complex jobs like this manually. So to manually focus stack, you want to put layer masks on all of your aligned layers. So you just go to here and add that in, and as default fill it in with black, and that hides that layer. So what I want to do here is, rather than try and blend them all together at the same time, it gets too complex. I like to just focus on 2 layers at a time. So I've kind of ordered them here. So we start with the foreground at the top and we run through to infinity at the back sequentially, and that makes it far easier. So if we start with here, what I do is on the image behind, I show it. That gives some sort of idea of where the boundaries between sharpness is. And if I start on my foreground shot and I switch to white and then I go up to the brush tool, I want to make sure I've got a fairly wide brush, but not too wide, not too crazy, and make sure it's got a feathered edge to it. And essentially here, I just want to start painting in this area around here, right across the bottom. And I think that's about where the boundary and sharpness is. And the way to test that is you can just turn it on and off, and you can see straight away there it looks a little bit sharper. Now essentially you just have to follow exactly the same process throughout the boundaries between your layers. So you can see I've moved the mask down one to show this layer and hide this one. So if I go back to my paint tool, and I believe that the sharpness lies in and around this sort of area. So if I paint this in all the way across like this, you can do a quick test. If you just turn it off and on, you can see straight away that sharpness has been added in there. I'm rushing a little bit here, but if you really want to do a really thorough job, I recommend zooming in and just paying more close attention to where you place your brush. You'll be able to pick up the bits that are out of focus a lot more easier. It just becomes quite easy when you do it like this to actually see the bits which are out of focus, and then also pay close attention to your mask in case you're missing any bits, because that's the downside to using quite a thin brush. It's quite easy to miss little segments out. Once you've gone through all of your layer masks and masked out the bits you don't like, you'll effectively have your focus stacked image. It will be sharp right from the foreground right to the background. Now I've rushed this. I can't stress enough that if you want to get good results with this method, this manual method, you really need to put the time in and zoom right into the image and analyze every single part of it if you want to get top results. But if you're willing to put the time in, it really will deliver fantastic results. Once you're happy with it, you then need to crop it in, get rid of the dead space around it, and then you want to merge all the images together and export them. Now, I have a few more images for this particular shot that I need to blend into this to get the final image, and I'll quickly show you that now. Now this is my focus stacked image. Now there's a few aspects of this that I wasn't particularly happy with that I managed to capture better in other exposures. So if I blend those in now, I should get a better final image. The first one was the overexposed moon here. The highlights are absolutely blown out and ridiculous, and that's because I ran this at a 30-second exposure because I needed to capture sufficient detail in the rocks. But I did manage to capture a shorter 5-second exposure, which if I blend that in now, hopefully won't blow out those highlights quite so much. So I've stacked the layers and aligned them, and I've put a mask on that. So now if I go to the radial gradient tool and draw out a white gradient from the center of the moon out, a fair distance, you'll see that it brings the moon in, and that looks a lot nicer. If we want to just make it look a little bit more natural, if we go to the paint tool and just make that slightly wider, just mask out the effect on the sea. I'm not too bothered about that. I'm really just concerned by the sky itself. Down here as well. So we come out, that instantly looks a lot better. Another aspect of this shot that I wasn't particularly happy with is because I ran this at 30 seconds, I picked up quite a lot of star trailing in the sky, and there's quite some ugly clouds in my actual base infinity focus. So I did take another infinity focus at a much shorter exposure time, and I think it delivered a better sky. So if I switch that on now, you can see that's much nicer, there's less star trailing, and I think the sky looks more impactful. So let's blend that in now. So if we go to the quick selection tool here, and if we just draw across there, add a mask in, and there we've got it. But the boundary looks a little bit ugly. So if we go to the gradient tool and draw up from the horizon a reasonable distance, straight away that fixes all the ugliness there. And then also, it's probably a good idea to zoom in around here and just have a quick look at this, the boundary of this headland, because if there's going to be any ugly patches, it's going to be around here. But that does not look too bad at all. So bringing the image back into Lightroom, there were a few final tweaks that I had to make to get the image absolutely spot on. I had to lift the exposure a little bit more because I was exporting it and it still felt far too dark. The foreground in particular was really struggling, so you can see I've lifted the exposure and I've lifted the shadows as well. I've added a touch more contrast and a touch more clarity, and I think that did the business here. There were a few other micro edits. You can see around here I had a little bit of flaring from the moonlight coming in here, so I corrected that in the final version. And also I did take another exposure where this part of the pool was, for some reason it was a lot stiller. There must have been no wind at that precise moment of time, and I got a lot clearer reflections of the stars in this part of the pool, so I blended that into the final image too. I'm massively pleased how the final shot come out. It was a real challenge, but generally anything worth doing in photography tends to be a challenge, and it's good occasionally to flex those post-processing muscles, which are probably bigger than my real muscles. Hopefully this video will be useful for you with regards to focus stacking and blending different exposures together, and hopefully you can translate that into your own photography. But if you've got your own suggestions for focus stacking and blending, your own techniques, please let me know in the comments, because I'm just on a journey like you. I'm not an expert. I'm constantly learning and picking up new tips and techniques myself. So I'm always open to adapting my process. So it'll be really interesting to see how you do it. As always, any likes, comments or subscribes are very much appreciated. Thank you very much for watching. I really do appreciate it, and I'll see you all soon. Goodbye.